Hey folks, welcome back to the ColeVette channel. Today it's a chassis chat and we're going to discuss a technical issue that I just could not chase down or figure it out. And so finally I decided to use the technical discussion board forum with the NCRS, and within moments I've gotten 20 replies, and one being a needle in the haystack solution. So stay tuned. Okay, so let's start with the wiring diagram. And if you've got your own garage and you're trying to fix your own car, this is probably what your diagram is going to look like after time. It's going to have some dirt on it, it's going to have some tracing lines through it, but it should be used. And this is what it looks like when it's used. All right, so we have, to begin with, the fuse box. Fuse box here is a lot different than what today's cars look like. There's no fusible link, there's no assortment and assembly of fuses that go to not only just the mechanical part of it, but also to electronics that we don't have, which is great. That adds to the visceral experience of these cars. It's so analog, it is so easy. I like how Jay Leno would say in a lot of his videos that back then when you saw this stuff, you thought it was so complex, and that, wow, how could I ever figure this stuff out? And then of course today's cars are just riddled with many different technical reasons to not want to do it, is probably a good way to say it. But here we go. So the fuse box here, you have the part that connects into the engine bay, and then this part is underneath the dash in the interior. And then this part here is showing you the back of each look like. We're going to focus on this one. This one here is going to show you the fuses and what the back of the fuse looks like, and then where it traces to. The fuse that was in question for me is this one here. This one is a 10 amp, and it traces to just a bunch of stuff, right? So we're going to walk through one of the traces. So if we go out from what would be the top on this box, but if you're in the car, this is going to be the right side coming out, because it's all reversed in this diagram. So we trace out of it, and then we already come to a splicing or a connection, and then it spiders out to a handful of different things, right? So we have a 20 that goes to a light green. We have a 18 that goes to a light green. We have a connection that goes into the back of the parking brake alarm. Down here, sorry about that, the parking brake alarm. And then we have a 20 light green as well. Now these, you just flip them over and you pick up to where they stop. So here's that 20 light green. We do that again. All right, so these, once you get to the trace to the side of the page, and in this case it'll be the right side, you flip it over, come back on the left side, and you can pick up on where that trace goes. So this light green then goes into a body connection. And then it can come out many different ways from there. Usually the connection that it goes into, its partner on the other side is where it's going to trace out of. And as you can tell, they all come out and they all keep going to more connections and more connections and more connections. And there's a lot of reasons, but mainly it's to get power to it and to ground it. So those are the two important parts of a mechanical connection. You obviously need ground, and you obviously need the power so you can create that circuit. And when you close that circuit, you've got the ability for that component to work. Okay, so we're going to stop here for just a moment. We're going to go over to the wiring diagrams. So this is the engine bay, engine harness, wiring schematic or diagram. And once it comes from the dash at the firewall, It'll come out to an ignition, ballast resistor terminal. Then it goes to the ignition coil, the temp sending unit, alternator, horn relay, passenger and driver's side horn, and then ground voltage regulator. All right, so looking at the wiring diagram, we're trying to figure out, at the time of trying to solve the issue, where this 10 amp connects to. And so one thing to always consider is that, in general, this whole box also has a connection to the rear harness. And then facing the front of the car, it has the dash or cluster harness, and then it has the engine bay harness as well. But we always got to keep in mind the rear harness connection to this. So the first one is going to be, we traced it to the ignition switch, then it traces to the temperature gauge, then it traces to the fuel gauge, and then it also traces to the parking brake alarm switch. And then the lamp in the cluster itself. So for that to happen, not only does it attach to the engine side, but it also attaches underneath the car to the cluster at a few different points. Ignition switch is in the cluster, the fuel gauge in the cluster, the temp gauge in the cluster, but the parking brake and alarm is underneath the cluster, and it goes, it's the truck looking lever handle that you'll pull out, and then it goes into the front of the engine bay as well, underneath the firewall. Picking back up with the wiring harness, this one is for the interior of the car. It starts at the firewall, the inside, the interior part of the firewall, and connects all through the back of the clusters, the ground on the inside on the Z-bar, and then to the courtesy lights, and then it has a connection to the rear harness. That is radio, rear lights, brake lights, all that good stuff. Power antenna, if you have that. So some things to point out for this trace is the ignition switch, the temperature gauge, and the fuel gauge, and then of course the ground. Which is around here somewhere. Here, instrument cluster ground. And then it goes out to the brake light switch, and the brake lights that's underneath the dash. It's just a different component, not connected to the cluster or the dash itself. Actually, the bracket to the parking brake is connected to the bottom of the cluster. Okay, so move that out of the way. And on this one, it continues on to more lights, the clock itself, the radio, heater blower motor, courtesy lights, ignition ballast. So this one will pump through, poke through the dash and the firewall to the engine bay, and then there's a ignition ballast resistor, bottom terminal connector, and then the windshield wiper motor and pump. Sorry about that. finger there. I'll do that again. Ignition ballast in the engine bay, and then washer connections, windshield wiper connections to the motor and the pump. Okay, here we pick up at the fuse block, and the one that kept burning out is this top 10 amp here. And so some of the low-hanging fruit for trying to fix this is take out the fuse, wipe it down with acetone, also see if the contacts are rusted or have some sort of condensation on them, dry that up, and then put it back in. Start the car and see if anything burns out again. Well, repetitively after I've done that, the fuse kept burning out. So I knew it had to be some sort of hot wire somewhere. Actually, at one point, not only was the fuse burning out, but it was melting. Like, it was getting hot. And there was something tragically wrong, catastrophically wrong with this whole thing. And when that goes out, you don't have temp gauge, you don't have fuel gauge. It really affects the way you could drive this car and be safe with it. So there was an issue for, I don't know, the first couple years with the car with the temp gauge. And that just ended up to be a quick anecdote. Just needed a new gauge. I took for granted that the gauge was good, and turns out all I had to do was replace that, and it started working. So aside from that though, this fuse kept burning, which meant I lost temp gauge and fuel gauge, which I wanted both of those solved. So tried to do a quick trace on everything through the schematics, and just kept failing. So always came down to, is it a good ground? Is it a good ground? Is it a good ground? I'll say it one more time. Is it a good ground? And I checked all the grounding and it looked good. Try to tighten them down again and again and again. No problems there. So next we'll go on to the connections to the rear harness. Alright, hey folks, we're picking back up here with the NCRS technical discussion that I put out and the replies that I got back on it. So let's start. So I made it a request or a plea to anybody out there technically to help me out, and I had said 1963 10 amp fuse keeps blowing or melting, please help. And so right away people jumped all over this. Alright, so some of the things I pointed out. Hey all, I have a wiring issue that seems to persist in terms of the 10 amp fuse. It keeps blowing or melting. I use the assembly manual. I can see how the wiring chases from the block and all the hardware that's in the loop. I recently hooked up a lighter. I tried to fix that, finally got to it. And it could have been the issue because it's a red wire, the dreaded red wire. When I replaced the fuse, it melted again after I disconnected that lighter. And as most of them know, the fuel gauge, the temp gauge, the backlights do not work when the fuse has an issue. Now, I'll throw a flag here right away. Finger. The back lights don't work. Missed that one. So I just can't figure out what the cause is here. Now again, just a dad in a dad's garage with just tools and my journey basically. There's a few things you're just not going to understand right away. But in the electrical system of these vintage cars or classic cars, it's very analog. And one of the first things to learn or consider, or lessons learned I can give off to you, is that keep in mind the individual wiring harnesses and where they connect. So I said I can't figure out what is the cause. I'm in progress. We're restoring the interior, and only have a few connections left. So that means there's some connections in the car still that aren't connected because I'm trying to restore those parts. And the clock wasn't connected. The parking brake wasn't assembled yet. The glove box light, which continues to be an issue, is not connected. But it's all covered with electrical tape. And I said, if anybody has any answers, please post help out. So the first one comes back. His suggestion, or their suggestion was, hey, get that wiring diagram and start tracing wires. That's a great one. The next one was someone focusing on the cigarette lighter because they caught on to the fact that that was something I recently did, and so they pointed out, some of the reproductions just aren't good, and what they look like. We'll go into that in another chassis chat about the cigarette lighter. I think that's worthy of its own conversation. The glove box light, always powered, and there's a bullet connection for that. And so you have to watch out for that dead connection. If that isn't fully connected, it may create some sort of spark back. Then we got look for all the physical connections to the back of the harness, and for anything that's melted, that's fair, melted, frayed, loose, etc., all that, because there's a dead short somewhere. And then somebody said I would first disconnect, or attempted to first disconnect the rear harness inside to eliminate the issues from the rear. Something I didn't consider. I put it on a list of things and try to get like kind of a priority of what I should trace down first, what would be low-hanging fruit. And on the list was the disconnect of the rear harness, but I just couldn't get my mind around it at the time. Then we got somebody that says, don't have a diagram handy, but the circuit also powers the fuel tank sending unit. Pull the rear harness connection apart underneath the dash, or pull the pink off of the sending unit from the fuel tank. Because it's an odd bod powered C2 sending unit receives 12 volts, a full 12 volts from the rear harness connector. And so something to point out, GM only gave a life expectancy of these harnesses for 15 years. When I got the car, I can't really say that it was the original harness, but it was in disrepair. There had been some Frankenstein splicing throughout it. And so the first thing I should have done was take out that harness. But as a new collector and a new owner, if it's working, you don't want to fix it, right? If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Original unrestored is definitely something I subscribe to, and in the hopes that that would have been the case for this car. It's a GM car, and regardless of the year and the vintage, the parts are not that expensive. So what a wonderful example to start with to take your journey on how to restore and maintain cars of this class. The barrier to entry, of course, is price, but again, we're going to go through in another chassis chat what to look for in the car you're buying and the value that you're going to get for it. Stay tuned to that one. So then we keep going. Since it powers the gauges, do you have the cluster out and apart? I believe sometimes the studs have fiber or plastic washers to isolate the power to the pins. So that was another easy, low-hanging fruit, but taking the cluster out is not easy if you know. If you didn't know, you would find out quickly that they're not easy. The connections aren't easy to get off, as well as the access to it from underneath and behind is not easy. And there's a cool trick with getting longer bolts to pull out the dash or the cluster while it's connected still and pull them out, but you still have to be a contortionist to get underneath it. Definitely pulling out that seat, driver's seat, is the right thing to do. Just a hint there. And then, let's see here, anything else? Yeah, and then someone chimes in, pull the connection one at a time using this procedure, disconnect the battery, use an ohm meter across the circuit, positive to top, new fuse to the end, negative to clean ground point, of course the cleaning part. You need to read very low ohms due to the short, maybe 2 or 3 or so. And so, but anyway, this one is pointing towards, start checking all the connections again, starting with the grounding and the power from the battery to all the hardware in the loop that run through that fuse. So once I considered all that, like I said, I put everything together into a kind of a punch list of low-hanging fruit and decided the easiest access I have actually is to the rear fuel sending unit, and disconnecting the pink or just that power to it right away would be the simplest way to figure it out. So I jacked up the back of the car, took a look at the connector, and for the first time realized how and I'll show a close-up to this, how weathered or used this fuel sending unit was. But again, it's one of those original non-restored, if it ain't broke, don't fix it situations. And the other thing too, it's a newer gas tank back there, and this was put back into it. So I'm thinking obviously the people that did this before me were experts, and that they were doing it because it still worked, and they wanted to keep the same original non-restored mentality. Turns out it probably just out of haste, probably just out of funding, probably just out of bonehead-ish, I don't know. But as a dad and a theme there, I would push off to anybody I would teach. Anything that has an electrical connection into it that is important to the functionality of your car, take it out. Give it a once over, make sure it works. If you have to grease it up, if you have to replace the connection, but restore that part and put it back in if you can. If not, you're gonna have to replace. So I disconnected that here. Let's see if I can go that way. It's my favorite pointer. Thanks again, StanceWorks. I'll put a link to him in the video, in the comments. But when I saw this, I thought, man, wouldn't it be interesting if this was the problem? Now, to get to this, you have fuel coming in through here. So I had to drain the fuel tank. Not only that, but making sure I jacked up the back of the rear of the car high enough that the rest of the fuel that I couldn't drain out of it was going towards this way, not towards the hole for the sending unit. And then finally had to get the specialty tool to take it apart. And you need that tool. Trust me, don't use screwdrivers, don't use any kind of wrenching. There's a perfectly made tool to take this out. I'll find that tool when we go specifically through this in another portion of this video. As soon as I disconnected this, long story short, put the fuse in, it did not, once I turned on the ignition, it did not burn out that 10 amp fuse again. So I stopped there because we need fuel. So I thought, hey, what effort would it be just to hang it up for a moment, get a new unit, or try to restore this one, and then get this car back into running. So I had to order it, had to wait for it to come through. Just a couple of days later, I got the new sending unit as I wanted to compare the new one to this one. And this one must be the original. It has some components on it that are just fantastic, actually, for the technology back then. Definitely not like the upgraded versions that will come out now. Especially this float. I really get a kick out of this float compared to the new one. Also, there's a sediment bag on the new one to catch any kind of dirt or debris that might be in your gas tank, and just a whole better setup, cleaner setup as well. So I pulled this out, put in the new one, and gosh, that could be its own tech talk or chassis chat by itself. Taking out, putting in the new sending unit. Amp was fixed. So long story short, after a pretty long time with that 10 amp fuse burning out, it was just, as I described going through the forum discussion, it was one person who understood the needle in the haystack to say, get your eyes on this, because don't forget, there is a third harness in the rear that also will connect and have an issue or have the ability to burn out that 10 amp at the top as well. So moral of the story here is you're not alone in your own garage if you want to do this kind of work. YouTube, fantastic videos on a lot of stuff, regardless of the vintage or the chassis. But also these technical discussions and forums are just amazing. The wealth of knowledge and the want for those that are on it to help others is exactly the community I want to keep building. Jay Leno is a big fan and advocate for this kind of community as well, and so champion on that one. Okay, here we have the sending unit. It is, as you first see, I know, really bad. But original non-restored is what I was going for, not knowing any better, and in hopes that it would work. And it's kind of a lazy way to do it, but at the end of the day, you know, you live and you learn, especially in a dad's garage. Here's the float. It is waterlogged. After you get to get your eyes on these kind of things, you kind of realize, well, this should be a little more spongy. It is not. In fact, it probably sat in a gas tank without gas for many years for it to get dried out like this. The connections to the front here, underneath, coming out of the fuel cell here, and those two. Those points need to be always cleaned, not rusted, no condensation, but it's underneath the car, and that's where, you know, if it's raining, water's gonna get up there. If there's humidity in the air, it may collect on there. There's a lot of wind going underneath the car, and that may assist it by design. But then here you go, here's the fuel connection for where the fuel line comes from the front of the car to where the fuel pump will call for the fuel. It'll send it up through the filter into the carburetor, and then from the carburetor, of course, into the sparking system distribution, and that's where we get the bang. It's going to mix it with the air through the carburetor, so that's the breathing and the bang. But I also thought, you know, what does this fuel line look like, and hope it's not bad either. I start to get an issue with that. I think it's a steel line from back then, and so it's going to rust. New ones are aluminum or stainless steel, actually. They're more stainless steel, and so more resistant. And I believe in this car, I've got the original fuel line in it, which, ticking time bomb, I don't know. Once I can lift the body off the car, we'll get to it. Okay, so you've got eyes on this fuel sending unit, and I thought, can I repair it? Answer was no. In the meantime, before I try to repair it, let's get a new one, get it in the car, as it's going to be anyway. In this case, instead of restoring, a replacement on this part is smart because it's going to be manufactured with today's specs and tolerances. Okay, to bookend the talk on the fuel sending unit being the issue, here is the replacement fuel sending unit. Ground, green, brown as well, I believe. Certainly a lot shinier. Sorry for the jumpy video. This is hard to get underneath here. I've taken it down from being jacked up while we fix the rear shifting issue with the running gear. All right. So altogether, a better looking sensing unit, obviously. And it was the reason for the shorting of that 10 amp, and this is the final product. Okay, so after showing you the replacement fuel sending unit, that kind of concludes this video and this chassis chat. Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate all the subscriptions and likes that I might get from this, and your support. Please do let me know if there's content you'd like to see. I do have kind of a list of things I want to get to, and I'm happy to fold in anything you need along the way to make this a more interesting and engaging channel. So once again, until next time, if we didn't know, we're about to find out. Thank you.